Hey everybody, it is Matt Weaver here with Roy Troyer, and we decided to do another episode on the subject of lessons from Babylon. And yeah, I think this will be fun. We actually got a pretty good response last time when we were doing that. At least we got more viewers, probably just because we included the name Babylon. People are like, ooh, mystery, intrigue, danger. Um, but yeah, we were talking last time. I guess it came up about all kinds of government systems and things of this nature. So you hadn't quite finished um, all that you have studied. So we'll let you start off with the rest of it.
Okay. Yeah, so as you mentioned last time, we covered a lot on the secular side. Um, I guess just to recap a little bit, we covered, the reemergence of, I guess I could call it reemergence because in the past, there's been different government systems that probably have attempted something akin to globalism, at least in their conquest. But in our case, the modern case was World War II. Following that, we see backlash against nationalism because of, obviously, even though I'm a nationalist, or I would consider myself to favor that system a little more just based on what I would see that God had in mind through what he did with the Tower of Babel and so on. Even though I recognize that, there's also obviously an element that, we have to be honest and admit that there's a lot of extremes that go with that I don't think God necessarily condones. And, our human sensibilities even can only take so much. So after all the bloodshed that we saw in World War II, there's all this backlash, and we see a global system developing in the form of, the United Nations and the World Health Organization and international court systems and things that never really were achievable before. All of a sudden, we see those coming into fruition. And, ultimately, what we learn, or at least from my perspective, from what we see in the Tower of Babel is, the synergistic, do I want to call it energy? That sounds like a new age term. The synergistic power that we see coming from people collaborating who aren't necessarily sanctified, it usually ends up producing just greater amounts of evil, and it's a compound effect, it seems. Um, so anyway, and we, got into some of the end times stuff, and perhaps we'll see a reemergence of some of this stuff as time unfolds. But everybody has their eschatological views. But anyway, so that was kind of what we covered last time. I wanted to get into, you know, how does this affect the church? I guess not only, how do we view globalism, but also like there's this element that also affects the church in that we also see the disintegration of the divisions that we've seen as, a corporate body throughout the world. And, for a long time, I guess the way it started off, obviously, I think most people are vaguely aware of the the history of the church in so much that it kind of started off organically, and then it morphed into this thing where, you know, the Romans got involved, and they have they're used to everything being done from the top down. So all of a sudden you have unity in so much that you have the Catholic Church ruling everything from the top down for most of Christendom. There's a few exceptions, but you have all of that going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, but obviously, most people are aware that in the 1500s there was just all around a movement of that even disintegrating. And then we had fragmentations of denominationalism that developed. And it seemed that, even though we didn't have this one big cohesive church, that everybody took their little fragment of the Catholic Church with them, in so much that they kind of structured all their little denominations the same way, in so much that they were very dogmatic and, um, you know, seemed like, as we look back, it would be probably considered dogmatic over small things. Um, so even, somewhere, I would say somewhere in the 20th century, late 20th century, denominationalism began to crumble. There's been non-affiliated churches in the United States since quite early on, but they were always a small margin of believers. Even up until the 1980s, according to what I was studying, leading up to this, non-denominational churchgoers were only about 5% of the population, the believing population, not the whole population. I think right now, if I remember right, the non-denominational affiliates make up about 22% of that demographic. And that's only second to the Catholic Church. And Protestantism, if we would want to call non-denominationalism a denomination, they would be the biggest denomination among Protestants. So that's interesting that we see this big shift away from denominational affiliation. And it coincides with the whole movement in the secular realm of, you know, breaking of barriers and national barriers and so on, and people meshing and having more unity possible and also practiced than probably ever before. Um, but there's still a lot of denominationally affiliated people in the U.S. But even as I mentioned in the last episode, most of those people are not dogmatically loyal to their specific denomination. If I meet a Christian somewhere, usually, there's a spark of connection there, and denomination never really is discussed. It's just not really an issue anymore. Um, Let me see. I don't know. Did you want to jump in at some point here, or should I keep going?
Well, if you look at, I mean, obviously you have, I think there's a general view, let's put it this way, that the there's this church universal aspect, right? Which is actually what Catholic means, but or wholesome, if you will. But there is a universal church, and one of the things you learn, like from Babel, for instance, is that there was this consolidation, right? And there
Yeah,
tends to be the desire for consolidation, even if you go down through history. You've got Eastern Western Church essentially roughly in those two categories. 10 is it 1053, I believe, schism happens and they split fellowship until the 1990s, I believe, something like that. So, um, so for a huge chunk of church history, you have these two big groups that separate, and then you have Protestantism, which is basically, I will not surrender to the will of powerful church. Um, and ever since Protestantism has had its rise, you have just an absolute splintering of ideas. And then those who want nothing to do with any kind of, oh, we are from him or we are from him or we do things that way, call themselves non-denominational, because we're just not any of that. We're just trying to be, as you put it, organic. And that is true. I was actually listening to a discussion the other day from Dr. John Harrigan, and he mentioned um, something that was pretty interesting, and that is that in the first century, your Jewish believers had their Jewish view. There ultimately there came about a Greek view, that had their kind of understanding of the Christian worldview, and then you had a Roman worldview that ultimately manifested. And if you really look at it, there's three different kind of strains of, as he put it, and he's right, three different strains of kind of relative categories you could put people in their view of Christianity. But I think that the I guess the thing that's it's kind of interesting to see happen is is none of it works the best. Let's put it that way. It doesn't really matter if you're Eastern, Western, they all have their isms, they all have their things, and it doesn't matter if you're non-denomination or if you're in a denomination or if you're in one of these, they all have issues. And some people say, well, that's just because everything's human. It's probably true. But we do claim to be led by the Spirit. We do claim to be, representatives of Jesus. And yeah, for myself, I guess some of the things I've looked at as like in the church world itself, there is the propensity, I guess the same mechanisms that drive secular society are very present in a quote church system. You have the
Hmm.
dynamics of power, you have the dynamics of hierarchy, um, and how control, um, basically the weapons of a church can be fear and shame. It's different than a government. Government can use force. Churches can't use force, but a church system can be established to shame people for not being good adherents, things of that nature. Not saying it's all right or wrong. It's just in and of itself, there's this kind of same pattern that you see in the secular side of things play out in the church side of things. And you have power struggles, you've got authority issues, you have misconduct, you have all kinds of things that'll happen. Regardless, it's why the government actually calls churches NGOs. They're governmental organizations, or they're organizations, but they're not governmental as far as they're not in government, but they consider them to be, rendering services and goods, which in and of themselves is kind of ironic if you think about a church can have its tax status because it's rendering goods and services to constituency, I guess. So, um, yeah, and I think in a large way, especially because in America there is that nonprofit reality to it, that since it is a legal organization, that churches have tended to kind of form themselves around a basic premise like that. And throughout history, the spread of Christianity has always been kind of like missionary, has starts church, and then churches are small, and then we really see the kind of the that a dynamic shift in the size of churches, really in the I think is the late 80s, early 90s, where you start to see the evolution of the megachurch play out, where it's like a different flavor of church, where you get to go into a big tent, uh, quote unquote, 1,000 or 1,500 plus member organization with all kinds of special care pastors in whatever capacity, huge organizations with big budgets, and show up Sunday mornings, do your church thing, and leave. Doesn't really require a lot from the congregation. So yeah, I don't know. Like, I have racked my brain to try to make sense of all of it because it's like, especially in our community, we have churches all over the creation. There's probably, who knows, 50, 60 churches in our community. And yet everyone would kind of be pretty convinced that the way they're operating it's pretty close to what the Bible would ask of a church. So
Yep.
that dynamic is interesting to me, and I don't always know what to make of some stuff like that. The thing that you'll see coming through is that oftentimes, and every organization has to, I guess, decide what works for them, but oftentimes, and it comes actually from the early church, this idea that the bishop is basically God on earth. and that whatever the bishop says you must do. That's very much an early church position. When I say early church, I'm talking second century writers, um, maybe late first century, but really second century writers. The second, third generation of the church really started to say, establish very strong authority in the church. You must obey the bishop. You must do what he says. And that's relying on a good bishop. If you have a bishop who's not so good, then you're going to be subject to all the abuse and the negative things associated with authority. So
Yeah,
anyway, that would be my opening line. It is a mystery a bit to me that Jesus himself never started a church, never had a church, never functioned in a church capacity, never organized the church structure. He was the Messiah. He lived in a Jewish context. His disciples followed in a Jewish context, and he himself went to synagogues and went to the temple. It is really in the view of the Gentiles that church is a thing. Okay.
right.
It's not a thing really amongst the Jews. They are an assembly or a congregation, but the temple is the center of worship in Judaism and in the messianic reality of Judaism, first century or whatever, they were still going to the temple, still practicing that thing. So I think sometimes we, in our replacement mindsets, tend to see the church as the house of God and our version of the truth to be the ultimate. And yeah, basically try to create our own flavor or denomination. But I'll leave my
Yeah.
thoughts at that.
Mm. Well, yeah, I mean, in our area, in our community, like you said, there's so many different churches, and perhaps that's why it's, an intrigue to you and I is because of our background. And I might be a little bit biased because of that. Obviously, most people who have experienced dogmatic denominationalism and have come to see a different perspective kind of have a bad taste in their mouth when it comes to denominationalism. So I want to be careful in how I approach this. I ultimately think that it's a good thing that denominationalism is disintegrating. And I hope I'm not being overly biased, in having that view because of my background. Obviously, you know, around here, like you said, everybody kind of thinks that they have the best answer to living, doing church structure biblically. And ultimately, what ends up happening is dogmatism on a, level of minutia. You had covered, the head covering here on an episode by yourself here lately. And that's a good example of that. Obviously, that's not maybe the best example because it is in the Bible. Worst case scenario, denominations are bickering over things that are not even necessarily scriptural. They're just things that they ideas of their own, which
Yeah.
that head covering plays into that because they also come up with ideas of their own of how that's supposed to look and all of that. But ultimately, we are, as people of God throughout the Bible, called to dwell in unity, you know, as believers. So I tend to think that if we can achieve unity without compromising sincerity, I think obviously that would be a good thing. I think that perhaps in the day in which we live, that's not necessarily the case. I think that some sincerity has been compromised. Seems like, you lose dogmatism over the small things and the pendulum is swinging. Perhaps it's swung a little bit too far in some cases to where people are not necessarily, even willing to consider the weight of right and wrong necessarily because of the bad taste they have in their mouth over bickering over things that don't necessarily pertain to the Bible. But that I guess my concern would be I think that ultimately it seems that perhaps God is doing something in the church in setting us up to where we can have unity in the right context. Perhaps there's revival coming, as so many people talk about, and then obviously that's all a good thing. Um, but right now, I think where we are in the church is we're kind of in a middle stage where um, we kind of have a little bit more of the mentality of the secular globalist mentality, maybe, where there's more of a ecumenical mindset, more of a tolerant view of everything. Maybe there's a humanist view that's come into play quite a bit in the church, where as long as there's not immediate harm to a person, that something might be acceptable, even though the Bible clearly teaches against it. Those are some of the snares that I think we might be falling into as we move away from a more rigid stance on things. Um, but obviously, the hope is that we can regroup and find balance in it all. But that's not going to happen, obviously, probably unless God is in the middle of it. Perhaps we'll see something kind of like we saw in Acts at some point. We'll just have to wait and see what the Lord has in mind, I guess. But it's obviously unprecedented and very interesting. I'm sure, the Lord has something in mind with it all.
Yeah, I mean, I just ran across this the other day in a conversation online where a person posted a statement, and it, and I understand we always look to try to solve the great mysteries of life, like, you know, quote unquote. And this gentleman in his fervor was like, we're really missing who we are in Christ. Like, when we really need to grab hold of this, and if we would, we would do greater works than what Jesus did. And that's seemingly true. I don't know that I disagree with that in and of itself. Classically called, what is it? Christos Vic, or what is it? Christ. Let me look
Christos
up the term.
Victoris, something like that.
Those Vic, Christus Victor. There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, where he is the king, and he is victorious over the things of the world, if you will. And I agree with it. I just, the problem is that so many times what manifests itself in the world where that is a thing is is fake, and oftentimes done for money, oftentimes done for power, and has very little to do with the actual workings of Jesus. And it's been a mystery to me. Like, it is. It's like, that's why Calvinism, oftentimes, like a Calvinist who, looks at sovereignty and everything as God's sovereign plan, and they tend to accept whatever reality they're in as God's sovereign will. Where we come from, the Amish, they often do that as well. Well, it's God's will, whatever,
Yeah.
just take it. It's His will. And that's why they have an argument, because it's like, it doesn't always work. Yes, we can have faith and we can all that, move mountains and the whole 9 yards, but it's like somebody told me once too, and it's true. Every faith healer still dies.
Yeah.
At some point there is still an end. It
Yeah.
isn't nice to think about, because I don't think it's God's will that we get unwell, that we deal with health issues and stuff. I don't know that it's His will. That whole sovereignty thing is a really complicated subject, because it supposes things about God and the way He operates His universe that I think it's just pretty hard for us to understand, because we don't see the full reality of the unseen realm. I think if we would probably have a little bit better context. But anyway, but in this discussion with this individual, I just questioning him out, because he's got this little rhema, this little spark of inspiration, and he's fired up. And I'm not, you're not trying to pour water on somebody's passion, but okay, so what is supposed to happen? Like, if and I followed that thread down at the end of it. It was the root core, it was like, well, I don't know. Like, I really don't know. I'm still digging. But, at the beginning, he was completely confident that this concept of us having all this power and abilities is the answer. And at the end of just asking some questions, it was like, well, I'm not sure. I'm still digging. So, and I'm not here to be the skeptic. I know skeptics can easily cause anybody with any kind of inspiration to wither because it's easy just to say, well, prove it.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that I look at. It seems like I was pointing to earlier in the first century, there weren't actually, like in the days of the apostles, there weren't churches as we see them today. And I made that point when we were in Israel. I never forget standing in Gamla in the synagogue. It's a very famous site. Jesus probably would have visited it, and you had the zealots, hold up there during the days of Josephus, and he was a commander and actually told, I think it was the 10th Legion up there in the north. He actually told them where to penetrate the walls of Gamla, and the city itself just committed suicide rather than fall in the hand of the Romans. But you look at the reality of what they believed. The Zealots, they believed in the kingdom of God. They believed in their right to exist in the land and to fight on behalf of God, and really saw themselves continuing in the uh, the Maccabees, kind of a Maccabean context, and they stood up to fight. You know, we would call this dominionism. You take dominion because God has given us the victory. And they stood up to fight against the Roman oppression, what they saw as anti-kingdom, as anti, their right, and Rome absolutely crushed them. And I was standing in the synagogue there, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. The mindset that existed in that time is so prevalent today in what we quote unquote call the kingdom. And the only reason we can have a mindset like that in a way is because the power of our military and the power of our government. They are powerful enough that they let us have our ideas. Let's put it that way. Like we have these mechanisms in our country that allow us to have, freedom of speech and religion, things of that nature, and that actually allows us to have these ideas that we can conquer the world. But in reality, almost every one of those movements has ended up exactly the way Gamla did, just a heap of stones. It's a ruin. And for whatever reason, this idea that we as Christians can have dominion and build up a kingdom in the name of God just doesn't work. And
Right.
it just, unfortunately, because the kingdom that we're looking for is eternal, it's not made with hands. It's not it's not man-made. Let's put it that way. It's God-made. And that the kingdom he has for us is within us. Yes, that's true, but it's not that we are physically building the walls, the buildings, the streets, the infrastructure of the kingdom. I
Hmm.
know some people have that kind of view, and they also believe that with the power of Jesus on our side, we will take over the world in revival. We will be so powerful, and revival will just take over the world. And it'd be nice if that was the case, but history just does not follow that. And the other side of what that all looks like is you have tremendous suffering that people have been through. That if sovereignty truly is the way the world works, just using this like determinism, then you'd have to make a conclusion to a degree that God is extremely harsh, that he's brutal. All of the suffering that has happened in the world is his will, is his purpose, is his design. That's cruel. That's extremely cruel. And it's why some people have lost their faith because they just don't see how it can equate. I'm recently going through a book. I'm not going to name it just because it's not really a biblical book. It's a different one, but it names things, human experiments that were done on people groups by different people. Japanese, the Nazis, Soviets. Tens of thousands of people that were just used like guinea pigs for whatever medical experiment. I mean, we know the stuff the Nazis. I mean, just unbelievable horror, just absolute atrocity that was committed. And one would, if we believe in the sovereignty narrative, you'd have to believe that that was now a sovereign act of God, that he wanted those people to suffer with the most unimaginable torture for no end. I mean, it was for the
Right.
knowledge, it was for the knowledge of it. It wasn't suffering for persecution's sake. It was just suffering, just straight up human cruelty.
Hmm.
And then you stop and think about all of history, and all of the wars that were fought and all the people that were died and all the civilians that, like, what is this world? Like, what is it? It is a mess. It is a mess. The only reason we can have dominionist ideas is because we have a nuclear capable country that can absolutely annihilate any competition or any country that would want to attack us. That's the only reason we have the option of having a life that we can just live in peace. And man, that just gets you thinking. The for myself to reconcile that, yes, I do believe God is sovereign in a sense. I don't believe that he dispenses his sovereignty on everything that happens in the world. He has withdrawn his sovereignty in letting it be a domain that operates off the fundamental principle of free will. I think
Right.
he can at times exert himself in this, and he's generally wanting to push history a particular direction. But there's so much senseless, needless waste and pain and suffering that you just can't say that this is God. It just doesn't make sense. It's like that can't be. It isn't God. Can't be that he just allows an innocent life to have the suffering. I mean, the childhood sickness stuff is the worst of it. You think God? I mean, okay, God's complex. Not going down the rabbit hole of, well, then if God, condones suffering, whatever. It's just my perspective of it is then we're not seeing the picture right. I look at it as we are in a war, and this world
Hmm.
is in a conflict, and there's a
Right.
conflict between good and evil, and that is ever present, and it's ever present in the church as well. In the body of believers, we're warned in the New Testament that there are wolves among the sheep. There are those who
Hmm.
want to tear at sheep, who want to tear people apart. Experience that in the history that I've been in the church. That's been the case. There are people amongst the congregants, people that are just, they're not good people, and their desire is not to do what is right, but to tear people apart and to be wolves and to cause divisions. And yeah, they're not good-hearted people. And again, it's just the church is a microcosm for what is happening at the greater level of humanity. And I think in some of the big old churches, what they created, and I don't necessarily disagree with it, but what they created, I have this philosophy that God, he gave Adam access to a garden, but truly what every human wants is their own little Eden. The whole idea of the American dream is that it's to have your own little nice, your own property, your own house, your own picket fence, your own car,
Right.
some autonomy in your own little paradise where you can create that paradise however you want to. That is the dream that God has given humanity. We all want to have our own little paradise. And in our houses, we design them the way we want. We decorate them the way we want. And it's beautiful when you go to the different places. People have different interests and ideas and architecture, and that's what creates the best parts of humanity. Um, and that's what God wants that, and church in a sense is also that. You can go to your little house church where you're in somebody's living room and talking about the Bible. Nothing wrong with that. Or you can go to a church building that's beautiful, that's inspiring. You walk in it and it just inspires you because it is
Art.
it's yeah, it's art. It's beautiful, and it means something. It's I think for the Protestants as a whole, they became very utilitarian, very
Yeah.
pragmatic, and church buildings are to be ugly. And that manifested itself in the Anabaptist world as basically, if you're Amish, you're meeting in barns or shops, so it's the more austere the conditions, the holier, I guess.
Well, that was
Wood,
practical in the beginning
yeah,
because they had
wooden
to hide,
benches
but
and everything else. It's great. But then, and then even in like Lutheran churches and stuff as a whole, they had stripped all the art out of the church buildings. Um, Eastern Church is very different. They have icons, they have different things that kind of point to the picture of Jesus, etc. And as a whole, I think there's some merit to that because we as human, there's enough hardship in life, let alone like not having art, beauty, and Edenic foretaste, if you will. Imagine everything is just ugly and awful and unorganized and uninspiring. And we
right.
have to just live in this humility, this perpetual state of misery. That's not what Jesus put out. Jesus went to the temple. The temple was a beautiful building, spectacular. He was zealous for the temple. He
Hmm.
wanted it to be a house of prayer. And it was not just this temple was a symbol of the actual like heaven, the temple in the heavens, and
Temple
it
of
was
God.
to
Yep.
be spectacular. So, inside covered in gold and palm trees and ornamental, and it was spectacular. Um, so there's something to be said for that. But then the antithesis to that is that now you have the building and there's no life in it. There's no life
Right.
in the people. They're just following a pattern, which tends to be a problem. But anyway, I just wrestling with that whole thing. I realized that the most righteous people in the Bible, the faith chapter, none of them went to church.
Mm.
They lived
Interesting.
their life with a singular devotion to, if you will, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they endured what they went through in patience, hoping for the promise, you know, knowing that there was a reason and that ultimately God would be vindicated. You know, it's like what Jacob worshiped God leaning on a stick with everything he went through in life and all the, you know, troubles he went through at the end of life. He just worshiped God leaning on a stick. That was faith.
Yep.
And seems to be what God is after. It seems to be. It doesn't seem to be that he's after for us. I mean, we're going to do human things because we're human. We're going to do our little Edens. We're going to create our buildings and our beauty and our art and all that. But it really comes down to the end of life. It wasn't how much influence we had. It's not how much power we had, how many resources we had. It's that leaning on a stick, worshiping God. You know,
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that was a lot that you just expounded on there. Um,
sorry.
no, that's fine. I'm just trying to backtrack in my mind what you all covered there. But as far as the whole Dominion thing, I find that an interesting topic. I'm not sure how that ties in, how you were tying that in with denominationalism versus not, but I do find it an
Phenom,
interesting.
dominion.
Oh, okay. There's okay. I think I get what you're saying,
Well,
but
it's basically like, every church stands up and says, "We are the true church and we are real," and they follow someone. And they all have kind of a sense of we're going to take over the world, if you will, like because our version is true. If you ask any Catholic, they're going to be like, "We're the original church." Then you go to
yeah,
the Eastern Orthodox, like, "No, we're the original church." And then you go to the Apostolics, "No, we're the new original church." And you go to the Mormons, like, "We're actually the original church." And you go to you know what I mean? You just go down the line
yeah.
and they're all like, "No, we're the real ones. Y'all are fake."
It's
And
kind of a splintering off of smaller versions of the
it is, but
Catholic
they don't
Church,
see it that way.
as I
They
would
see it
say.
as
Oh,
like
right, right.
restorative, like they are bringing back the original. They are the original, and it's just dominionism regurgitated. It's just
Hmm.
another group who feels they have the answers for the world, exerting their power and their ideology. And I was saying that in contrast, when you look at the faith chapter of the leaders, ultimately, no churches, no
And
movements
no
like that.
drive, no zealous, or no zealotry, as in the way that zealots were viewed in the first century.
No conquering. They just live quiet lives
Right.
and believe God.
Yeah. Now you did have obviously conquering as they went into the land out of Egypt, but that's where the sovereignty of God comes in. There is dominionism that happens, but I think where people lose their way is when they don't leave things at the discretion of God. You know, Adam was given dominion over the earth and the animals and so on, but Jesus is the second Adam, right? So I think if we try to put ourselves in place of Adam, I don't think we're quite there, except obviously in a fallen sense we're like him, but not we become like his calling in Jesus. You know, that's where the dominionism comes in, but then it's at his discretion and at his sovereign will. I think where people lose their way is they don't necessarily always wait on the Lord when they move forward in spiritual warfare and so on. And that sometimes there's people ginning up ideas and even, sometimes there's very evil things that we see and we recognize and we think, well, that's not right. But I would say there's even a time and a place to come against that. If you don't have God's prompting, then you're not going to be taking dominion over that. You're not going to be conquering that. If God's even, with Israel as an example, a lot of what they did is a perfect picture of the way things operate in the spiritual realm. It was basically the kingdom here on earth.
Mhm.
And, so we see that picture of even when they were operating militarily, they didn't always just assume that it was God's will to go and annihilate evil. Sometimes, or, ideally always, they would ask the Lord, are you going to give us victory if we go into this land? Are you going to give them into our hands? And I think that many people who are overly zealous in what you would call dominionism, and I don't know, maybe you're thinking more militarily. I know that on
Now,
there's also,
it's a mentality of conquering. It can be
hmm
it's the idea. Yeah, I mean, it was expressed militarily, like in the days of the Holy Roman Empire or,
right,
Constantine himself. Um, some people like brought up Munster. I guess there were Anabaptists that militarily took action. Um, but in short, like that's an idea. I mean, the Zealots were the same. They militarily took action because they were trying to continue in this ancient tradition of restoring Israel.
hmm right. But I think there's a lot of people these days that wouldn't necessarily look at it that way, but more from a spiritual warfare standpoint. But like I said, even from that standpoint, there is God's sovereignty to contend with. We don't always understand what's going on in the spiritual realm and why God doesn't want to come up against a certain stronghold or a certain organization or whatever the case might be. We don't understand. All we see is that there's evil there, and we think we should be taking that down in Jesus' name. But it's not going to be effective unless the Lord is sovereignly leading you there, and we don't know the reasons why He wouldn't lead you there. We just have this idealistic mindset that you see evil and you demolish it and you take territory and well, there's an ebb and flow, and there's probably going to be an ebb and flow um, until Jesus returns. And yes, he is structuring things in the background in the unseen realm, but we don't know his method. We don't know what he's trying to build necessarily. So we need to keep that in mind, as we walk by faith and not we're not a singular atom figure um, having the whole structure in our own minds and developing it, we need to let him, I guess, do that work.
So let's look at it this way. So in the Old Testament, you have God's, I talk about this in my book, but you have God's nation in Israel,
Hmm.
and he chooses that nation by choosing a father and creating a nation out of a family
Hmm.
and giving that family, look, these are your rules, this is whatever, and I will be with you and I'll be your God and etc. And then you have the nations around them who are constantly trying to probe at that promise, at that reality. And then you come up to the days of Jesus, you have where you have this Messiah figure. And part of the Messiah's calling, like it or not, is to come as a warrior and to actually permanently establish Israel and its place in the world forever. That is the Davidic promise that it will take place. So, in short, he still has to fulfill that aspect of it, and you don't spiritually realize all of that stuff.
Right.
There's just no way to, right? And what happened is because of the destruction of Israel, and specifically Judah in 70 AD, there's many that believe that that was the death nail for all of the hopes of Israel, which makes no sense because it's like all of this prophetic information and material suddenly shut down by the Romans forever. And now what? Now you have this individual named quote unquote Christ who is just magically the fullness of all of the hope of Israel and expectation, which is true. However, it will be physically manifested. If Jesus
Hmm.
doesn't physically manifest the kingdom when he returns and establish his rule and rule over the nations with a rod of iron, the whole book is a fallacy. If it's just a reimagining, re-spiritualizing, re whatever ancient Jewish philosophies, like we're lost, we're hope, like we're hopeless. I mean, the proof of the power of his message was the resurrection, right? And if the resurrection, like Paul says, didn't actually happen, we're the dumbest people alive. And so we look for that power, and it's been thousands of years, and people have had thoughts of, well, we need to restart the kingdom or we need to take authority and whatever. I like what you said as far as every battle they had to seek the Lord whether or not to take it. It wasn't a blanket approval to just go and commit massacre after massacre. They actually had to ask, what about these people? What about this battle? What about that city? And the Lord would say, yes, go, or, whatever. They'd have to get approval, which is interesting. It is interesting. We often think the sovereignty of God, because of the way we conceptualized him, I guess, is that he's so powerful. He's so, you know, there's so much power that he can influence it. But the picture we get of his sovereignty is is not necessarily, I mean, we like to throw the term out all knowing. He knows everything, which I think he does. But he is also in our image, or we're in his image, I should say. And how do we face reality? It is moment by moment. We learn from history, we learn from our experiences, and yet the every moment of consciousness is a new thing. It's not a it's not a closed loop. Let's put it that way. So we tend to think of God as being outside time, space, and matter, which he is, and we tend to think that his knowledge is that he knows the whole human history, future, and end as a closed loop. I'm not sure that that's exactly how it works. I think he's walking reality with us. Like his spirit is with us as we experience life. We can look back through human history and we can see patterns. We can see these things play out, and you can kind of predict what's going to happen because humanity is predictable.
Yeah,
Just
we go
like
in
if you look
cycles.
at, well, just like if you look at lions, you can predict that they're going to pounce on prey, but the exact scenario is going to look a little different. But
Right.
you can deduce, um, you can deduce like principles. So you can deduce things that operate. And but I still think God is actually literally walking through the moments with us. I think eternity is just eternal consciousness. It is that he has always been conscious, and doing things, and we have joined in that. That is why we're conscious beings versus animals that aren't conscious beings. They're alive, but there's no awareness that they're alive in the sense that they can think. They can, like, there's a
Not
higher level of
self-aware.
intelligence and there's a higher level of awareness, if you will. Uh, but in short, yeah, I mean, you can it reduces to biological life, but in short, we're more complex than that. Um, and I think God walks through it. And the reason I say that is, like, for instance, in the scene when Ahab, it was his time to die. I think it was Ahab or Ahaz, one of those two. It says that the council met in heaven, and God asked, "Well, what do we do? It's his time to die. How should this be done?"
Yep.
It's, well, if God in his foreknowledge knew all of the things, like, why would he even ask the question? That seems silly. But he's actually seemingly walking through these experiences with his people. Even even if you look at the conquests, yeah, if he had his foreknowledge, you'd think he'd put his angels in the right places to hold back the powers of darkness. But no, there's like, okay, go here, do this, walk around 7 times, you know, all right, go to AI or I, and oops, no, you shouldn't have done that. Now you have to live with the consequence. Like,
Yeah.
God is, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's where some of that stuff, it's like God seems to be walking with and in
Yeah.
and through the situations with people. To me, that gives me more comfort. If God is pre-planning all the terrible things that could happen in the world, that's awful.
Yeah. Some people would argue there's foreknowledge, but not planning.
It's because of
Which that
determinism. It's determined, but that is planning. That is
I
planning. You
suppose. I
you
mean, if you,
can't
if
determine something without planning it. Like,
right,
even if it's subconsciously, it's still
I
planning.
guess some people would say that he knows it, but isn't planning it. Stepping back from his sovereign position, and
It's perhaps
it's a
true.
it's
It's
very
perhaps true, but I
complex.
think
But
we get these ideas that, this is the will of God, and sometimes it is, but it's like you said, it is a faith journey. We have to walk in faith. I'm not here to criticize. It's just these are questions I've wrestled with myself, and I struggle with the arguments laid out by people who, hold to that covenantal sovereignty view. It just, the world doesn't work that way. And I mean, the only reason they can get away with it is because we live in a fairly well-to-do society. But when you get
hmm
in around suffering and pain, it's like, oof.
right,
And free will makes a whole lot more sense, because it's like, boy, people are bad and these people are doing bad things, and it's, how else can you make sense of it? Um, Now, there's no denying that Christianity has had probably by far the most positive effect. I just went through the Museum of the Bible in DC last weekend, and it is eye-opening to see the effect of the Bible on society and humanity. When people have the words of life, even if they may not be on track and do the right thing, the positive effect that the morality of the Bible has on society is undeniable.
hmm
When you have a basic morality that teaches you to love your neighbor, that's a fundamental clash with almost any other world system out there. Loving your neighbor, even the whether you're far right or far left, that principle of loving your neighbor is what actually makes society civilized.
hmm
It is the principle that restrains the worst of evil, because it's like taking advantage of another person in any, you know, capacity, if you will, is not love. And that principle is actually what keeps us all living our happiest of lives. So, interestingly
yep,
enough.
yep, it's true.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Roy, we are at about an hour. Please, I have talked too much. You need to finish us out with some good, strong comments.
Well, I guess I'll just finish up with some verses that I had in mind to read. like I had gotten into earlier with some of the concerns of, the breaking down of denominationalism and where we are with that kind of an in-between stage, it almost seems. 1 Corinthians 11:18 says, "For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part." So in the first section there, he's speaking against divisions, but then he brings out division that he believes is actually healthy. He says, "And I believe it in part, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." I think that that kind of encapsulates um, the view that we perhaps need to take on in where we are as a church, in that we should strive for unity and not be divisive, like you said in the first part, but then also recognize that there will be factions that will develop organically as those who are sincere and genuine among the people in the church will automatically kind of be separate from other people. And, even in the Gospels, Jesus brings out that he did not come to bring peace but a sword, just simply because people who stand on righteousness, it just people don't know what to do with them, and it tends to bring division. But ultimately, unity is what we're striving for. Psalm 133 says, "Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It's like the precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes." It goes on and gives some more illustrations of what it's like. But ultimately, you know, true believers and true brethren, we need to be striving to dwell in unity. And I think that's a good, lofty aim to have. But let's not be discombobulated if, there's some organic factions that develop that are not just bickering over the small things, but actually something that God expects to happen when people are sincere in their faith.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Yes. Well, that brings this to an end. I think the lessons are clear. If you really look at Babel, you see the foundations of what we call civilization today. You see that archaeologically, you see that politically, and you see that even religiously. And like it or not, Babel is the what it is. I mean, you have this mystery Babylon, for instance, that's at the core of the last days scenario, and it seems to be Mystery Babylon seems to be a thing that stretches beyond time. Like one of the things that um, is thought that Babylon actually existed before the flood,
Mm.
at least in its
They were
own
trying to
records.
rebuild it.
In its own records, that is the case. It supposedly has writings that would have survived the deluge, the flood.
Mm.
Um, and it is this city who is the blueprint for society. And it seems to be that the tale of the world is really the tale of two cities. There is the New Jerusalem, or there is Jerusalem, I should say, the heavenly Jerusalem, and then there is the city that the enemy has, I guess, fundamentally. And maybe when we say city, we could say kingdom, and we could say civilization. Um, there is the heavenly example, and then there is the adversarial example, and we see the power of these two. Um, what should we call them? Operating principles at work in the world. The heavenly city that will come and actually make its place here, and yet it's competing with this mystery Babylon, um, this adversarial civilization. I don't know how else to say it,
Right.
because there's you get the picture all through Revelation too, that the picture of the two women, there's the harlot and there's the bride.
Right.
The prophets speak of that too. There's back then there was Babylon and there was Israel, and Ezekiel, Gog, Magog fighting against Israel. There's always been this light dark kind of context. The Essenes believed in the whole conflict of light and dark. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about that nature, whether we're talking about it governmentally or in the church world or in any part of life, it doesn't matter. You're going to be dealing with these two operating principles. There are people who are of the kingdom of light, and there are people who are the kingdom of darkness.
Hmm.
There are people in every circle who are under the governance of Jesus, if you will, or are citizens in his administration, and there are those who are citizens in the administration of the evil one. So this wrestling is just part of our life, and you know whether it's earthly governments or churches or church leadership or anything like that, there's a fight, there's a battle, there's ideological conflict, and you just can't escape it. Debate,
Yep.
the whole center of debate in general is because there's two ideologies that can agree. So you get together to present both so people can choose one or the other.
Yep.
The nature that there is such a strong division between light and darkness basically tells you there's two operating principles in the world. You could say there's more, but there's really, if you summarize it, there's two. There is
Yep.
those on God's side who are fighting for justice and truth and peace and love, and those on the other side who are fighting for self, for darkness, and for, um, you know, the things. All
The
right,
things.
we will end it. So anyway, thank you, and like and subscribe, and for some of you who don't get alerts, you can hit the little bell, and you'll be reminded if there's a new episode. So anyway, God bless you, and have a good day.